December 1942. A cold winter morning at the Army Air Force's headquarters in Washington, D.C., General Hap Arnold, commander of the entire United States Army Air Forces, sat in his office with a problem that kept him awake at night. You have to understand, the war was devouring pilots faster than America could train them. Every day, hundreds of new aircraft rolled off assembly lines in California, Texas, New York, and Michigan. Shiny P-51 Mustangs, massive B-17 Flying Fortresses, formidable P-47 Thunderbolts, all of them desperately needed on the front lines in Europe and the Pacific. But there was nobody to fly them from the factories to the ports. Male pilots were being rushed overseas to engage in combat missions. The ferrying backlog was growing by the hour. Arnold faced a stark reality. America was building the most powerful air armada in history, but those aircraft were sitting idle on runways instead of fighting the Axis powers. It was a logistical nightmare. That morning, Arnold had received two proposals on his desk. Both involved using women pilots to ferry military aircraft domestically, freeing up male pilots for combat duty. The first proposal came from Nancy Harkness Love, an experienced pilot married to a high-ranking officer in the Air Transport Command. The second came from Jacqueline Cochran, a famous racing pilot and businesswoman who had already been ferrying bombers across the Atlantic for the British Air Transport Auxiliary. Arnold stared at both proposals with deep skepticism. Imagine, for a moment, the culture he lived in. He had spent his entire career in military aviation, surrounded by men who believed that flying, especially military flying, required physical strength, technical knowledge, and nerves that only men possessed. The idea of women flying military aircraft seemed, to many of his colleagues, somewhere between laughable and dangerous. Arnold leaned back in his chair and spoke the question that would echo through the next 2 years of American aviation history. Can a slip of a girl, fresh out of flying school, safely handle a B-17 Flying Fortress in bad weather? Can she master the controls of a P-47 Thunderbolt, one of our fastest and most powerful fighters? Can she be trusted with our most advanced bombers, our experimental aircraft, our entire aerial arsenal? It was not a rhetorical question. Arnold genuinely did not know the answer. Nobody did. Women had been flying civilian aircraft since the early days of aviation. Amelia Earhart had captured the world's imagination with her record-breaking flights. Jacqueline Cochran herself had won the prestigious Bendix Trophy in 1938, beating male competitors in a cross-country air race. But civilian flying and military flying were considered two entirely different worlds. And this is a distinction that many people today might not fully grasp. Military aircraft were faster, heavier, more complex, and far more dangerous. They required extensive training, physical endurance, and the ability to handle emergency situations under extreme pressure. The prevailing wisdom among military men was simple. Women might be capable of flying small, light civilian planes, but they could never master the heavy bombers and high-performance fighters that America's needed to win the war. Arnold made his decision. He would approve both programs on a trial basis. Nancy Love would form the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, known as the WFS, which would recruit experienced women pilots who already held commercial licenses and had logged significant flight hours. Jacqueline Cochran would establish a training program for women with less experience, creating new military pilots from scratch. If these women could prove themselves capable of safely ferrying military aircraft, Arnold would expand the programs. If they failed, the experiment would end quietly, and the skeptics would be proven right. What Arnold did not anticipate, what nobody in the Army Air Forces could have imagined in that winter of 1942, was that these women would not merely meet the standards set for them. they would exceed them. What if I told you they would fly not just some military aircraft, but every type of military aircraft in the American arsenal? All 77 different models. From tiny primary trainers like the PT-13 Cadet to the massive B-29 Super Fortress, the largest and most advanced bomber in the world. From stable transport planes to temperamental fighters that had earned reputations as widowmakers among male pilots. They would accumulate 60 million miles in the air, deliver over 12,650 aircraft to military bases across America, and prove beyond any doubt, a detail that, when you really stop to think about it, changes everything. That skill and courage in the cockpit had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with training, determination, and sheer guts. But in December 1942, all of that was still ahead. All that existed was Arnold's question, hanging in the air like a challenge. Can they really do this? Can American women fly military aircraft as well as men? The next 2 years would provide an answer that even Arnold himself would find astonishing. Because by December 1944, at the graduation ceremony for the final class of women pilots, Arnold would stand before those women and say words that would enter the history books. Now in 1944, it is on the record that women can fly as well as men. This is the story of how that record was written. This is the story of how American women conquered the skies in World War II, one aircraft at a time. This is the story of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP, and their fight to prove that when it came to flying, capability was not determined by gender, but by skill, training, and an unshakable refusal to accept the word impossible. The question on General Arnold's desk was clear. Could American female pilots really fly every military aircraft in World War II? The answer, as history would prove, was not just yes. It was yes, and better than most people thought possible. September 10th, 1942. Newcastle Army Air Base in Wilmington, Delaware. 28-year-old Nancy Harkness Love stood on the tarmac, watching as 27 women pilots arrived to begin a mission that had never been attempted before in American military history. These women were not fresh recruits. They were not beginners. They were some of the most experienced female pilots in the entire United States, handpicked by Love herself to form the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, an organization that would prove women could do the same jobs as male ferry pilots. Nancy Love was the perfect person to lead this groundbreaking unit. Born into a wealthy family in Houghton, Michigan, she had learned to fly at 16 and earned her pilot's license at the age of 16 in 1930. By 1942, she had logged over 1,200 hours of flight time, far more than most military pilots had when they graduated from flight school. She held a commercial pilot's license with instrument and horsepower ratings, qualifications that put her in the top tier of American aviators regardless of gender. She was also married to Robert Love, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff for the Air Transport Command, which gave her direct access to the military leadership who controlled pilot assignments. Love had spent months lobbying the Army Air Forces to create a women's ferrying squadron. She argued that there were dozens of highly qualified women pilots in America who could immediately begin ferrying aircraft if given the chance. These women did not need extensive training. They were already skilled pilots who simply needed military authorization to fly military planes. The Air Transport Command faced a critical shortage of ferry pilots, with new aircraft piling up at factories faster than they could be delivered to military bases. Love's proposal offered an immediate solution: recruit experienced women pilots who could start work within days, not months. The requirements Love set for her squadron were extraordinarily high. And this is a crucial point. Applicants had to be American citizens between 21 and 35 years old. They needed a high school diploma or equivalent. Most importantly, they needed a commercial pilot's license and a minimum of 500 hours of flight time, with at least 50 hours in the previous 12 months. Think about that for a second. These requirements were actually more stringent than what was required for male civilian pilots joining the ferry service, who only needed 300 hours. Love deliberately set a higher bar because she knew her pilots would face intense scrutiny. Any accident, any failure, any hint of incompetence would be used as evidence that women could not handle military flying. Her pilots had to be not just good but exceptional. 28 women made it through Love's selection process and reported to Newcastle Army Air Base in September and October of 1942. They came from diverse backgrounds, but they all shared one thing: a passion for flying that had driven them to accumulate hundreds of hours in the air at a time when female pilots faced constant discrimination. Betty Gillies, who became Love's executive officer, had learned to fly in 1929 and had worked as a test pilot and flight instructor. Cornelia Fort had been giving a flying lesson to a student over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked, making her one of the first American pilots to encounter enemy aircraft in World War II. Helen Mary Clark, a school teacher from New York, had saved for years to afford flying lessons and eventually became a flight instructor. These were not society women taking up flying as a hobby. They were serious, professional aviators who had dedicated their lives to aviation. Love established strict rules for her squadron. She knew that any scandal, any breach of conduct, would be used to shut down the program. She told her pilots, "If the WFS are to succeed, our personal conduct must be above reproach. There cannot be the faintest breath of scandal. Among other things, this means you may not accept rides with male pilots." The women wore uniforms Love had designed herself, since the Army had not bothered to create uniforms for female pilots. They faced constant skepticism and hostility from male pilots who believed women had no place in military aviation. Ground crews often refused to service their aircraft. Male pilots made jokes about powder puff pilots and predicted the women would crash within weeks. It was an uphill battle from the moment they arrived. The WFS proved them wrong on their very first mission. On October 22, 1942, 6 WFS pilots ferried 6 Piper L for Cub liaison aircraft from the Piper factory in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, to Mitchell Field on Long Island, New York. The flight covered over 200 miles of mountains and unpredictable weather. All 6 aircraft arrived safely, flown with precision and professionalism. It was a small mission, but it was perfect. The WFS had delivered their first military aircraft without incident. Over the following months, they would ferry thousands more. Nancy Love had a larger vision, however. She did not want her pilots limited to small liaison planes and trainers. She wanted to prove that women could fly the same high-performance aircraft as men, the powerful fighters and heavy bombers that were the backbone of American air power. The Army Air Forces had a policy restricting women to aircraft under 90 horsepower and later raised it to 200 horsepower, which excluded virtually all combat aircraft. Love fought relentlessly against these restrictions. She argued that limiting women to small aircraft made no sense when women had already proven they could handle more complex planes. She personally demonstrated her skills by checking out an increasingly powerful aircraft, showing military officials that a woman could master the controls of fighters and bombers. In February 1943, Love became the first woman to fly the P-51 Mustang, one of the fastest and most advanced fighters in the American arsenal. She flew it from the factory to the Newark airport, proving that women could handle its 1,200 horsepower engine and high-speed performance. Later that year, she checked out in the B-17 Flying Fortress, the iconic four-engine heavy bomber. When male pilots expressed doubt that a woman could handle a four-engine aircraft weighing 65,000 pounds fully loaded, Love demonstrated her skills with flawless takeoffs, landings, and in-flight maneuvers. Can you imagine the pressure of that demonstration flight? One by one, the restrictions fell. By late 1943, WFS pilots were cleared to fly nearly every aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory. Nancy Love and her original WFS pilots were the pioneers who proved it could be done. They opened the door that had been closed to women in military aviation. They showed that with proper training and experience, women could match men in the cockpit. They were the originals, the first women to fly military aircraft for the United States Armed Forces. Their success made everything that followed possible. While Nancy Love focused on recruiting experienced pilots, Jacqueline Cochran had a different and, you could argue, more ambitious vision. She wanted to create a training program that would take women with relatively little flying experience and transform them into military-grade pilots capable of flying any aircraft in the American arsenal. Cochran believed that there were thousands of American women who had the intelligence, courage, and determination to become excellent pilots if given the opportunity. She was going to give them that opportunity. Jacqueline Cochran's life story read like an American dream. Born Bessie Pittman around 1906 in desperate poverty in Northwest Florida, she grew up in conditions so harsh that she later refused to discuss most of her childhood. She was likely born in a sawmill camp, raised by a family so poor that basic necessities were luxuries. She worked as a child in cotton mills and as a beautician. It's a background that's hard for many of us to even picture today. But Cochran possessed a drive and ambition that refused to accept poverty as destiny. She moved to New York, established her own cosmetics company, and became a wealthy businesswoman. In 1932, at a dinner party, she met Floyd Odlum, a millionaire investor who would later become her husband. Odlum suggested that learning to fly would help her expand her cosmetics business by allowing her to travel quickly to meetings and clients. Cochran took that suggestion and ran with it. She earned her pilot's license in just 3 weeks in 1932. Let me repeat that. 3 weeks. An astonishingly short time that demonstrated her natural aptitude and fierce determination. But Cochran did not stop at earning a license. She became one of the most accomplished racing pilots of her generation, male or female. In 1938, she won the prestigious Bendix Trophy, defeating male competitors in a race from Los Angeles to Cleveland. She set numerous speed and altitude records. She competed in international air races, flew experimental aircraft, and became friends with other famous aviators, including Amelia Earhart. By 1941, Cochran was arguably the most famous female pilot in the world, a celebrity whose achievements were regularly featured in newspapers and magazines. When war broke out in Europe, Cochran saw an opportunity. She believed that women pilots could contribute significantly to the war effort if given a chance. In 1941, before the United States entered the war, she wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt suggesting the creation of a women's pilot program. The idea was initially rejected by the Army Air Forces. Undeterred, Cochran recruited a group of American women pilots and took them to England, where they joined the British Air Transport Auxiliary Ferrying Aircraft for the Royal Air Force. Cochran herself flew bombers across the Atlantic, demonstrating that women could handle long-distance flights in heavy aircraft under wartime conditions. When General Arnold approved Nancy Love's WFS program in September 1942, Cochran was furious. She had been pushing for a women's pilot program for over a year, and now Love had gotten approval first. But Arnold had not forgotten Cochrane. He asked her to create a separate program focused on training women pilots from scratch. This, you see, was the compromise that would change everything. In November 1942, Cochrane established the Women's Flying Training Detachment, which would train women to become military pilots even if they had limited previous flying experience. The training would be conducted at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, remote location far from major cities where the women could focus entirely on learning to fly without constant public attention. Cochrane's vision was revolutionary. She wanted to prove that women could be trained to the same standards as male military pilots. Her training program would be just as rigorous, just as demanding, and just as comprehensive as the training male cadets received at Army Air Force's flight schools. If her graduates could meet the same standards as men, nobody could claim that women were inherently incapable of military flying. The success or failure of thousands of women would rest on the training program Cochrane built. In August 1943, the Women's Flying Training Detachment and the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron officially merged into a single organization, the Women Airforce Service Pilots, abbreviated WASP. Nancy Love remained in charge of ferrying operations, commanding the women who delivered aircraft across America. Jacqueline Cochrane became the overall director of the WASP, overseeing training at Avenger Field and managing the careers of over 1,000 women pilots. It was an uneasy partnership at times. Love and Cochrane had very different personalities and management styles. Love was reserved, methodical, and focused on proving women's competence through steady, reliable performance. Cochrane was flamboyant, ambitious, and constantly pushed for more recognition and more opportunities for her pilots. But despite their differences, both women shared the same ultimate goal, proving that American women could fly military aircraft as well as any man. By the time the WASP program ended in December 1944, Cochrane's training program at Avenger Field had produced over 1,000 graduates who went on to fly dozens of different aircraft types and complete thousands of missions across the United States. Her vision of training women to military standards had succeeded beyond what even Arnold had thought possible. The women who graduated from Avenger Field would go on to fly every aircraft in the American arsenal, including experimental jets and the massive B-29 Super Fortress. They would prove that with proper training, women could match men in every aspect of military flying. The numbers. Well, this is where the story gets really fascinating. They tell a story of overwhelming enthusiasm and rigorous selectivity. When the Army Air Forces announced that it would accept applications from women who wanted to become military pilots, over 25,000 American women applied. They came from every state, every social class, every background. Teachers and nurses, secretaries and factory workers, college students and housewives. What they had in common was a burning desire to fly and serve their country. Out of those 25,000 applications, only 1,830 women were accepted into training at Avenger Field. That means more than 93% of applicants were rejected. Let that sink in for a moment. Getting into the WASP training program was harder than getting into most elite universities. The requirements were straightforward but demanding. Applicants had to be American citizens between the ages of 21 and 35. They needed a high school diploma or equivalent education. They had to stand between 5 feet and 6 feet tall and weigh at least 105 pounds, requirements designed to ensure they could physically reach the controls of military aircraft and handle the physical demands of flying. Most critically, they needed proof of some flying experience. Early classes required applicants to have a private pilot's license and at least 35 hours of flight time. Later classes raised the requirement to 75 hours and eventually to 200 hours as the program became more competitive and selective. For most American women in the 1940s, accumulating those flight hours represented a significant financial investment and personal sacrifice. Flying lessons were expensive, typically costing $10 to $15 per hour at a time, when many women earned less than $25 per week. Think about what that meant in 1940 dollars. Women who wanted to become pilots often saved for months or years to afford lessons. They faced skepticism and discrimination from flight instructors who believed women lacked the temperament for flying. Some instructors refused to teach women at all. Others charged women higher rates than male students. Women who persisted despite these obstacles and accumulated the required hours demonstrated extraordinary determination even before they applied to the WASP program. The application process itself was rigorous. Women submitted detailed forms documenting their education, flying experience, and personal background. They provided letters of recommendation from flight instructors and employers. They underwent comprehensive physical examinations that checked everything from vision and hearing to heart function and reflexes. The medical standards were identical to those required for male pilots, with no accommodations made for gender. Women who passed the initial screening were invited to report to Avenger Field for training. Many traveled across the country, often using their own savings to pay for train tickets, since the WASP were civilian volunteers who did not receive military travel allowances. The women who arrived at Avenger Field came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. Some were wealthy women who had taken up flying as a hobby and discovered a passion for it. Others were working-class women who had scraped together every dollar to afford flying lessons. There were college graduates with degrees in mathematics and engineering. There were beauticians and saleswomen, farmers and artists. What united them was not their social class or education, but their love of flying and their determination to serve their country in the war effort. One of those women was Dora Doherty, who would later become famous as one of only 2 women to fly the B-29 Super Fortress during World War II. Doherty had graduated from Northwestern University with a degree in psychology in 1942. She learned to fly through the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a government initiative that provided low-cost flight training to college students. When she heard about the WASP program, she immediately applied. She was accepted into the class that began training in March 1943 and graduated in September of that year. Within a year of graduating, she would be demonstrating the largest bomber in the world to skeptical male pilots who believed women could not handle such a massive aircraft. Another trainee was Cornelia Ford, who had been working as a flight instructor in Hawaii when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Ford was in the air with a student on the morning of December 7, 1941, when Japanese fighters flew past her plane. She immediately landed, narrowly avoiding being shot down, and became one of the first American pilots to witness the attack. Ford joined the WFS in September 1942 and became one of the original female ferry pilots. Tragically, she was killed in a mid-air collision on March 21, 1943, becoming the first WASP to die on active duty. Her death was a stark reminder of the dangers these women faced every time they climbed into a cockpit. It's a reminder that their service, even stateside, was far from safe. The women accepted into training knew they were joining an experimental program that could end at any time. They knew they would face skepticism, hostility, and discrimination. They knew they would be held to higher standards than male pilots, that any mistake would be magnified and used as evidence that women could not handle military flying. Faced with that, what would you have done? They came anyway. They reported to Avenger Field in West Texas, ready to prove themselves in one of the most demanding training programs in American aviation. Of the 1,830 women accepted into training, only 1,074 successfully graduated and earned their silver wings. That means approximately 41% of women who began training did not complete the program. And you have to understand, this wasn't a failure of the women, it was a testament to the program's intensity. Some washed out due to inability to master the required skills. Others left due to medical issues, family emergencies, or the sheer physical and mental demands of the training. The WASP program did not lower standards to increase graduation rates. This is a key point. If a trainee could not meet the standards, she was dismissed, just as male cadets who failed to meet standards were dismissed from flight school. The women who graduated had truly earned their wings through skill, hard work, and determination. Avenger Field, located outside the small town of Sweetwater in West Texas, was a place of extremes. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the metal cockpits of training aircraft into ovens. Winter brought freezing winds that howled across the flat prairie, making night flights a test of endurance. Dust storms could reduce visibility to zero within minutes. The nearest city, Abilene, was 40 miles away. Can you even picture how isolated that felt? The base was isolated, remote, and perfect for the task at hand, turning civilian women into military-grade pilots. The training program lasted approximately 7 months, divided into phases that progressively built skills and confidence. The program was modeled directly on the Army Air Force's training curriculum for male cadets, with virtually identical coursework and flight requirements. This was intentional, and it's a critical point. Jacqueline Cochran insisted that her graduates meet the same standards as men so that nobody could claim women received easier training or special treatment. The instructors were male Army Air Forces pilots, many of them experienced combat veterans who had been rotated back to the United States for training duty. These instructors had no reason to go easy on their female students. Many initially doubted that women could meet military flight standards. The women would have to prove themselves in the air, flight after flight, day after day. The training day began before dawn. Trainees woke at 5:30 in the morning for physical training. They ran, did calisthenics, and engaged in exercises designed to build the strength and endurance needed for long flights. After breakfast, they attended ground school classes that covered the theoretical knowledge every pilot needs. They studied military law and regulations, learning the rules that governed military flying. They learned aeronautical physics, understanding the forces of lift, drag, thrust, and weight that allow aircraft to fly. They studied aircraft engines in detail, learning how to diagnose problems and understand the mechanical systems that kept planes in the air. They learned navigation, mastering the use of maps, compasses, and dead reckoning to find their way across long distances without modern GPS technology. They studied meteorology, learning to read weather patterns and understand how wind, clouds, and storms affect flight. And if you think that sounds like a full college semester, they were just getting started. One of the most challenging subjects was Morse code. Now, most of us today have never had to learn this, but military pilots were required to master Morse code for radio communication, since voice radio was not always reliable during the war. Trainees had to achieve a minimum speed of sending and receiving coded messages, a skill that required hours of practice and concentration. They also studied aircraft recognition, learning to identify dozens of different American, British, German, and Japanese aircraft types instantly from silhouettes and photographs. In combat zones, the ability to instantly distinguish friendly from enemy aircraft could mean the difference between life and death, and ferrying pilots needed the same skills in case they encountered enemy aircraft near coastal areas. Ground school consumed over 560 hours of classroom time. Just stop and think about that number for a second. Trainees sat through lectures, took notes, studied into the night, and took written examinations on every subject. The academic demands were intense, equivalent to a college-level engineering course compressed into several months. Women who had not studied mathematics or science since high school found themselves working through complex physics problems and mechanical diagrams. Those who could not keep up with the academic pace washed out, regardless of their flying ability. But the heart of the training was flying. Each trainee was required to complete a minimum of 210 hours of flight time before graduation. They began in primary trainers, the smallest and simplest aircraft in the training sequence. The PT-13 Cadet and PT-17 Stearman were open cockpit biplanes, sturdy and forgiving, ideal for teaching basic skills. Trainees learned takeoffs and landings, which, as any pilot will tell you, are the two most dangerous phases of any flight. They practiced climbs and descents, turns and banks, stalls and recoveries. They learned to feel the aircraft respond to their inputs, to understand the relationship between control inputs and aircraft movement, to develop the muscle memory and instinct that separate competent pilots from great ones. After mastering primary trainers, trainees advanced to basic trainers like the BT-13 Valiant, known to pilots as the Volti-vibrator because of its distinctive engine vibration. The BT-13 was larger, faster, and more complex than the primary trainers, with a more powerful engine and retractable landing gear. Trainees learned to manage more speed and more complexity, to handle the increased workload that came with more sophisticated aircraft. They practiced formation flying, learning to maintain precise position relative to other aircraft while flying at high speed. They practiced night flying, navigating by instruments, and limited visual references. Night flights were particularly challenging and dangerous. And this is a tragic but important part of the story. Several trainees were killed in night training accidents when they became disoriented and crashed. The final phase of training involved advanced trainers like the AT-6 Texan, a powerful single-engine aircraft used to train fighter pilots. The AT-6 demanded precision and skill. It was fast, responsive, and unforgiving of mistakes. Trainees practiced advanced aerobatics, learning to perform loops, rolls, and spins deliberately and recover safely. They practiced instrument flying, learning to control the aircraft using only the instruments in the cockpit while wearing a hood that blocked outside visual references. Instrument flying was essential for navigating through clouds and bad weather, and it was one of the most difficult skills to master. Pilots who could not maintain control of their aircraft on instruments washed out. Throughout training, instructors evaluated every flight. After each flight, the instructor would debrief the trainee, pointing out mistakes and areas for improvement. Trainees who consistently made the same errors or failed to show improvement were eliminated from the program. The training was deliberately designed to be stressful and demanding because, as you can imagine, military flying is stressful and demanding. Instructors wanted to see how trainees performed under pressure, how they responded to emergencies, whether they kept their composure when things went wrong. And things did go wrong. Training flights are inherently dangerous, and accidents happen even with experienced pilots. Engine failures, equipment malfunctions, weather emergencies, pilot errors, all of these claimed lives during WASP training. 11 women died in training accidents at Avenger Field. Each death was a tragedy that affected the entire training community. The surviving trainees attended memorial services, mourned their friends, and then climbed back into their aircraft and continued training. Faced with that, what would you have done? They understood the risks. They accepted them. They refused to quit. The women who survived the training program and graduated from Avenger Field had earned their wings through genuine merit. They had demonstrated mastery of ground subjects and flight skills. They had proven they could handle stress, danger, and setbacks. They had shown they possessed the judgment, skill, and temperament required of military pilots. At graduation ceremonies, they received their silver wings, the same wings worn by male Army Air Forces pilots. Those wings represented not just completion of training, but entry into an elite group of aviators. The graduates were ready for their assignments. They were ready to fly military aircraft across America. They were ready to prove that women could do the same jobs as men in military aviation. When WASP graduates received their first assignments, they did not immediately jump into high-performance fighters or heavy bombers. Like male pilots, they started with simpler aircraft and worked their way up as they gained experience and demonstrated competence. The progression from trainers to frontline aircraft was carefully managed, with each step building on the previous one. And this system was critical, as it ensured that pilots developed the skills and confidence needed to handle increasingly complex aircraft safely. The PT-13 Cadet and PT-17 Stearman served as the foundation of American pilot training during World War II. These primary trainers were rugged, reliable biplanes with fixed landing gear and relatively low-powered engines. They were slow, with a maximum speed of around 124 miles per hour, and they were forgiving of student errors. The open cockpit exposed pilots to wind, noise, and weather, which actually helped develop better situational awareness. Student pilots learned to feel the wind, judge their speed by sound and sensation, and develop an instinctive sense of the aircraft's position and attitude. WASP pilots who ferried primary trainers flew them from manufacturing plants to training bases scattered across the United States. These were often long cross-country flights, sometimes covering hundreds of miles over varied terrain and through changing weather conditions. Flying an open cockpit biplane across the country in winter was a test of endurance. Pilots wore heavy leather flying suits, goggles, and gloves, but they still froze at high altitudes. Summer flights were equally challenging, with intense sun and heat causing dehydration and fatigue. Navigation required careful attention to maps and landmarks, since the small trainers did not have sophisticated navigation equipment. Pilots followed rivers, railroads, and highways, constantly checking their position against their maps. Remember, there was no GPS here. This was pure analog skill. As WASP pilots gained experience, they transitioned to basic trainers like the BT-13 Valiant. The BT-13 represented a significant step up in complexity and performance. It had a more powerful 450 horsepower engine, giving it a top speed of over 180 miles per hour. It featured a closed canopy, retractable landing gear, and more sophisticated instruments. The jump from primary to basic trainers required pilots to think faster, process more information simultaneously, and manage more complex systems. The BT-13's landing gear had to be manually lowered before landing, and forgetting to lower the gear resulted in an embarrassing and expensive belly landing. The aircraft's increased speed meant that mistakes happened faster and had more serious consequences. The AT-6 Texan, the advanced trainer used for the final phase of pilot training, was faster and more demanding still. With a 600 horsepower engine and a top speed of over 200 miles per hour, the AT-6 handled more like a fighter than a trainer. It was highly responsive to control inputs, which made it excellent for teaching precision flying, but also meant that rough or imprecise control inputs resulted in rough aircraft movement. Pilots learned to make smooth, coordinated inputs, to think ahead of the aircraft, to anticipate what the plane would do before it did it. The AT-6 was also used to train fighter pilots in gunnery and dive bombing techniques, so it could pull high G-forces in aerobatic maneuvers. WASP pilots who ferried at SIXS had to be skilled, confident aviators capable of handling a high-performance aircraft in all conditions. Ferrying trainers might sound less glamorous than flying fighters or bombers, but you have to understand just how essential this work was. The Army Air Forces trained hundreds of thousands of pilots during World War II, and every one of those pilots needed aircraft to train in. Keeping training bases supplied with aircraft required a constant flow of deliveries. WASP pilots ferried thousands of trainers, ensuring that flight schools had the aircraft they needed to produce the pilots America needed to win the war. And by demonstrating their competence in trainers, WASP pilots earned the trust and respect needed to move up to more advanced aircraft. If trainers were the foundation of American pilot training, then you have to think of fighters as the cutting edge. Fast, agile, and effective, American fighters like the P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-38 Lightning were engineering marvels designed for one purpose: achieving air superiority by shooting down enemy aircraft. These were among the most challenging aircraft to fly in the entire American arsenal. They demanded quick reflexes, precise control inputs, and absolute confidence. And WASP pilots flew them all. The P-51 Mustang was arguably the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing over 1,400 horsepower, the Mustang could reach speeds of over 440 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest propeller-driven fighters ever built. That's a capability that's hard to even imagine in the 1940s. Its long range allowed it to escort bombers all the way from England to Berlin and back, a capability that proved decisive in the air war over Europe. But the Mustang's high performance came with high demands on its pilots. Its powerful engine generated enormous torque that tried to roll the aircraft during takeoff and landing. Its high speed meant that everything happened faster, leaving less time to react to problems. Its aerodynamic design made it sensitive to control inputs, rewarding smooth precision, but punishing rough handling. Nancy Love became the first woman to fly a P-51 Mustang in February 1943, ferrying one from the factory to Newark Airport. When she climbed out of the cockpit, male pilots and ground crew members crowded around, astonished that a woman had just flown one of the Army Air Force's hottest fighters. You can almost feel the silence on the tarmac. Love's flight broke an important psychological barrier. If a woman could safely fly a Mustang, what aircraft was beyond her capabilities? Following Love's lead, dozens of other WASP pilots checked out in the Mustang and ferried them from factories on the West Coast to ports on the East Coast, where they would be loaded onto ships bound for Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt presented a different set of challenges. Nicknamed the Jug because of its large, barrel-shaped fuselage, the P-47 was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II, weighing over 17,000 pounds fully loaded. It was powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double WASP radial engine with 18 cylinders producing 2,000 horsepower. These are staggering numbers for a single-seat fighter. The Thunderbolt could reach speeds of over 425 miles per hour and could dive faster than almost any other aircraft in the war. Its weight and power made it a stable gun platform and gave it tremendous durability in combat, but they also made it challenging to fly. The P-47 required a long takeoff run because of its weight. It climbed slowly compared to lighter fighters. In the air, its sheer mass gave it momentum that had to be carefully managed during turns and landings. WASP pilots ferried hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts from the Republic Aviation Factory on Long Island to ports and military bases across America. One remarkable statistic highlights their contribution. During the last 6 months of 1944, every single P-47 that left the Republic Factory was ferried by a WASP pilot. Let that sink in for a moment. Every single one. Male ferry pilots had been pulled from that duty and sent to other assignments, and WASP pilots took over completely. They delivered those aircraft flawlessly, proving beyond any doubt that women could handle one of America's most powerful and important fighters. The P-38 Lightning was unique among American fighters. It was a twin-engine design with 2 Allison engines mounted in long booms on either side of a central nacelle that held the cockpit and armament. The twin-engine configuration gave the Lightning long range and high speed. It could exceed 400 miles per hour, but it also made it more complex to fly than single-engine fighters. Pilots had to monitor 2 engines simultaneously, watching for any signs of trouble with either one. If one engine failed, the asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine would try to aggressively spin the aircraft, requiring immediate and precise control inputs to prevent a spin that was often impossible to recover from. The Lightning's twin-boom design also created unusual aerodynamic characteristics, including a tendency to enter compressibility at high speeds in dives, a phenomenon that could cause loss of control. Despite these challenges, WASP pilots mastered the P-38 and ferried them across America. They learned the aircraft's quirks and characteristics, developed the skills needed to handle engine-out emergencies, and delivered the aircraft safely to their destinations. Some WASP pilots later said the P-38 was their favorite aircraft to fly because of its power, speed, and distinctive appearance. It was a pilot's airplane that rewarded skill and punished carelessness. The P-39 Air Cobra and P-63 King Cobra were unusual fighters with the engine mounted behind the pilot rather than in front. This mid-engine configuration left room for a 37mm cannon that fired through the propeller hub, creating a powerful ground attack weapon. But the unusual weight distribution affected the aircraft's handling characteristics. The P-39 had a reputation for being difficult to recover from spins, and it cost several pilots their lives during training. WASP pilots who flew the P-39 and P-63 had to be especially careful to maintain proper speed and avoid stalls that could lead to spins. Ferrying fighters was demanding work. And you have to remember this part. Unlike bombers, which had multiple crew members, fighters were single-seat aircraft. The pilot was alone, responsible for navigation, aircraft management, weather decisions, and emergency response. Fighter cockpits were cramped, with instruments and controls tightly packed around the pilot. Long ferry flights could last 6 to 8 hours with only brief fuel stops, requiring intense concentration and physical endurance. Fighter pilots could not stretch, move around, or take breaks. Imagine sitting in that cramped space for hours, constantly scanning instruments and outside references, fighting fatigue and discomfort. WASP pilots proved they could handle it. They ferried thousands of fighters across America, from California to New York, from Texas to Michigan, from Florida to Washington. They mastered the high-performance characteristics that made these aircraft so effective in combat. They delivered America's fighters to the pilots who would fly them into battle against the Axis powers. And they did it so well that by late 1944, male ferry pilots were no longer needed for fighter deliveries in certain regions. The WASP had taken over that mission completely. If fighters represented speed and agility, then you've reached the next level. Heavy bombers represented raw power and technological complexity. The Boeing V-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator were the workhorses of the American strategic bombing campaign, capable of carrying tons of bombs deep into enemy territory while defending themselves with multiple machine gun turrets. These were massive four-engine aircraft that weighed over 50,000 pounds empty and over 65,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition. Flying them required not just physical strength, but exceptional judgment, multitasking ability, and technical knowledge. The B-17 Flying Fortress was one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II. Its four Radar 1820 Cyclone engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower, gave it a top speed of around 287 miles per hour and a range of nearly 2,000 miles with a bomb load. The B-17 could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and was armed with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns for defense. It earned its reputation for toughness through countless missions over Europe, often returning to base despite severe battle damage. But that toughness did not make it easy to fly. In fact, what the official reports don't always tell you is that the B-17 required constant attention from its pilots. For engines meant monitoring 4 sets of instruments, for throttles, for mixtures, for propeller controls. Any one of those engines could fail at any moment, requiring immediate action to maintain control and continue the mission. When General Arnold first questioned whether a slip of a girl could handle a B-17 in bad weather, he was expressing genuine skepticism shared by many experienced pilots. The B-17 was big, heavy, and complex. It required physical strength to handle the controls, especially during takeoff and landing when the aircraft was at its heaviest and most difficult to control. The control yoke required significant force to move, especially in emergencies. Male pilots who flew the B-17 often commented on how physically exhausting it was to fly long missions in bad weather, constantly fighting the controls to keep the aircraft on course. This was the core of Arnold's skepticism. Was it even physically possible for a woman to do this for hours on end? Nancy Love answered Arnold's question in late 1943 when she personally checked out in the B-17 and flew it from the factory to the East Coast. She demonstrated that with proper technique and skill, a woman could handle the Flying Fortress just as competently as a man. Following Love's pioneering flight, other WASP pilots checked out in the B-17 and began ferrying them regularly. They learned to manage the 4 engines, to handle the aircraft's weight during takeoffs and landings, to navigate cross-country routes that could span over 1,000 miles, to deal with the inevitable mechanical problems that arose during long flights. The B-24 Liberator was built in larger numbers than any other American bomber, with over 18,000 produced during the war. The B-24 had better range and carried a heavier bomb load than the B-17, but it was also more difficult to fly. If the B-17 was a tough but reliable truck, you could think of the B-24 as a temperamental race car. Its high aspect ratio Davis wing gave it excellent fuel efficiency, but made it less stable and more sensitive to control inputs than the B-17. Pilots described the B-24 as touchy and said it required constant attention. The B-24's tricycle landing gear, with a nose wheel instead of a tail wheel, made it easier to see during taxi and takeoff, but required different landing techniques than conventional gear aircraft. The B-24 had to be landed in a precise attitude or it would bounce dangerously. WASP pilots who ferried B-17s and B-24s faced all the challenges that male bomber pilots faced. They flew long cross-country routes, sometimes in marginal weather. They dealt with engine failures, which, and this is a surprising detail, were relatively common given the complexity of the aircraft and the fact that many were brand new from the factory and had not been thoroughly broken in. An engine failure in a four-engine bomber was not necessarily an emergency. The aircraft could fly on three engines, but it required immediate action to shut down the failed engine, feather the propeller to reduce drag, and adjust power on the remaining engines to maintain altitude and control. WASP pilots practiced these emergency procedures repeatedly until they became automatic reflexes. Winter weather presented particular challenges for bomber ferry flights. Icing was a constant threat. Ice forming on wings, propellers, and control surfaces could add thousands of pounds of weight and disrupt the airflow that kept the aircraft flying. Severe icing could force even a skilled pilot to make an emergency landing or, in the worst cases, result in loss of control and a crash. WASP pilots learned to recognize icing conditions and avoid them when possible, to use the aircraft's de-icing systems when necessary, and to make emergency landings if conditions became too dangerous. One remarkable story involved WASP pilot Florine Miller-Watson, who was ferrying a B-17 from California to New Jersey in winter conditions. Over the Midwest, her aircraft encountered severe icing. Ice built up on the wings and propellers despite her use of de-icing equipment. The aircraft became heavy and sluggish, difficult to control. Put yourself in that cockpit for a second. Watson knew she had to get out of the icing conditions or she would crash. She dove the aircraft to a lower altitude where the air was warmer and the ice began to melt. The maneuver worked, and she was able to continue her flight and deliver the aircraft safely. It was exactly the kind of quick thinking and skilled flying that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. By late 1944, WASP pilots had ferried hundreds of heavy bombers across America. They had proven beyond any doubt that they could handle the largest and most complex aircraft in the American arsenal. They had demonstrated that physical strength was less important than proper technique, that women could manage the complexity of multi-engine aircraft, that gender was irrelevant when it came to flying skill. It's a lesson that, when you really stop and think about it, applies to so much more than just aviation. The skeptics who believed women could not fly heavy bombers had been proven decisively wrong. Some aircraft earned reputations that went beyond merely difficult. They were considered high-risk, challenging aircraft that cost pilots their lives if they made even small mistakes. Two bombers in particular carried this grim reputation: the B-26 Marauder, which pilots called the Widowmaker because of its high accident rate during training, and the B-29 Superfortress, which had cost a famous test pilot his life when an experimental version suffered catastrophic engine failure. These were aircraft that male pilots feared and avoided when possible. And this, right here, is where the story takes a fascinating turn. These were exactly the aircraft where WASP pilots would make their most dramatic contributions, proving that skill and proper training could overcome even the most challenging aircraft. The Martin B-26 Marauder was a medium bomber powered by two massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines, the same engines used in the P-47 Thunderbolt. The B-26 was designed for speed, with a top speed of over 280 miles per hour, much faster than earlier medium bombers. But that speed came at a cost. The B-26 had relatively small wings for its weight, giving it a high wing loading and requiring high landing speeds. When the B-26 first entered service in 1941, it had an accident rate so high that pilots nicknamed it the Widowmaker, the Martin Murderer, and, if you can believe this, the Flying Prostitute, because it had no visible means of support, referring to its small wings. The B-20 SIX's high landing speed of over 130 miles per hour left little margin for error. If a pilot came in too slow, the aircraft would stall and crash. If a pilot came in too fast, the aircraft would float down the runway and run out of space before touching down. If an engine failed during takeoff or landing, The asymmetric thrust could spin the aircraft out of control before the pilot could react. Early B-26 pilots, many of whom had trained in slower, more forgiving aircraft, made mistakes that led to tragic outcomes. The accident rate was so high that the Army Air Forces considered canceling the entire B-26 program. Instead, the Army improved the training program, lengthening the wings slightly on later models to reduce wing loading, and assigned experienced instructors to teach pilots the specific techniques needed to fly the B-26 safely. The accident rate dropped dramatically once pilots learned to respect the aircraft's characteristics and fly it properly. But the B-20 SIX's reputation as a dangerous aircraft persisted, and many pilots remained nervous about flying it. WASP pilots flew the B-26 Marauder extensively, particularly in target towing missions where the bomber would tow a target sleeve behind it while anti-aircraft gunners on the ground practiced shooting at the target. Target towing was among the most dangerous missions assigned to WASP pilots. They were deliberately flying within range of anti-aircraft fire, and accidents happened. Machine gun rounds sometimes hit the towing aircraft instead of the target. One WASP pilot, Mabel Rawlinson, lost her life when her B-26 crashed during a target towing mission. Despite the dangers, WASP pilots continued to fly the B-26, proving that with proper training and respect for the aircraft's characteristics, it could be flown safely. By the end of the war, the B-26 had the lowest loss rate of any American bomber, vindicating the aircraft's design and the pilots who flew it. But the B-26 was not the most challenging bomber WASP pilots would face. No, that distinction belonged to an aircraft that represented the absolute peak of 1940s technology, the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress, the most advanced bomber of World War II and one of the most complex aircraft ever built up to that time. The B-29 was enormous, with a wingspan of 141 feet and a length of 99 feet. It weighed over 70,000 pounds empty and over 140,000 pounds fully loaded. It was powered by four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing over 2,200 horsepower. The B-29 could fly at altitudes above 30,000 feet, had a pressurized cabin for the crew, and featured remote-controlled gun turrets operated by gunners using sophisticated sighting systems. It could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over a range of more than 3,000 miles. It was designed specifically to bomb Japan from bases in the Pacific, and it would ultimately prove decisive in ending the Pacific War. But in early 1944, the B-29 had a problem. On February 18, 1943, the second B-29 prototype had suffered a catastrophic engine fire during a test flight. The aircraft crashed near the Boeing plant in Seattle, costing famed test pilot Eddie Allen his life and his entire crew of 10, along with 19 people on the ground. The crash investigation revealed that the powerful R-3350 engines had serious overheating problems that could lead to fires. Boeing made extensive modifications to fix the problems, but the crash had shaken confidence in the aircraft. When production B-29s began arriving at training bases in early 1944, many experienced pilots were reluctant to fly them. They had heard about the prototype crash. They knew the engines still had problems. Some pilots openly refused B-29 training assignments, claiming the aircraft was too dangerous. You have to understand the level of fear this aircraft generated. Colonel Paul Tibbets, a highly experienced B-17 pilot who would later gain fame as the commander of the unit that dropped atomic bombs on Japan, was assigned to oversee B-29 training at Eglin Field in Florida. Tibbets recognized that the reluctance of experienced pilots to fly the B-29 was becoming a serious problem. The B-29 was essential to the war in the Pacific, but if pilots refused to fly it, the entire program could be delayed or compromised. Tivitz came up with an unconventional solution. What if I told you his plan was to use psychology? He would use women pilots to demonstrate the B-29, deliberately making male pilots ashamed of their reluctance to fly an aircraft that women could handle. In June 1944, Tivitz requested 2 WASP pilots to report to Eglin Field for special assignment. The women selected were Dora Doherty and Dorothea Dee Moorman, both recent graduates of the WASP program who had demonstrated exceptional flying skills and cool judgment. Neither woman had any experience with 4-engine bombers, let alone the massive and complex B-29. Tivitz personally trained them, teaching them the aircraft's systems, limitations, and proper flying techniques. The training was intensive but brief. Think about this next part. After just 3 days, Tivitz declared Doherty and Moorman ready to demonstrate the B-29. On their very first demonstration flight, with a planeload of male pilots and crew members watching nervously, one of the B-29's engines caught fire shortly after takeoff. This was exactly the scenario that had cost Eddie Allen his life. Put yourself in that cockpit. Many pilots would have panicked. Doherty and Moorman did not. They calmly shut down the burning engine, activated the fire suppression system, feathered the propeller, and continued flying on 3 engines. They completed a full circuit of the field and landed safely, demonstrating perfect control throughout the emergency. Their calm handling of a serious emergency on their very first flight in the aircraft was a masterclass in airmanship. Over the following weeks, Doherty and Moorman flew the B-29, nicknamed Ladybird and decorated with a feminine image on the nose, multiple times. They gave demonstrations to visiting generals, senior officers, and groups of male pilots. They performed all the standard maneuvers, showed how smoothly the B-29 handled despite its size, and demonstrated emergency procedures, including engine-out landings. Each time they flew, they proved that the B-29 was a safe, reliable aircraft when flown by skilled pilots who understood its systems and limitations. The effect was exactly what Colonel Tivitz had intended. Male pilots who watched women fly the B-29 with confidence and skill felt ashamed of their own reluctance. If women could fly the Super Fortress, how could they justify refusing to fly it themselves? Complaints about the B-29 dropped dramatically. Male pilots stopped requesting transfers to avoid B-29 duty. The psychological barrier had been broken. And this detail, when you really stop to think about it, is remarkable. Within months, hundreds of male pilots were flying B-29s in training and combat missions in the Pacific. Doherty and Moorman had accomplished their mission perfectly. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. The 2 women had never flown a 4-engine bomber before they reported to Eglin Field. They received only 3 days of training. Yet they demonstrated better judgment and smoother flying skills than many experienced male pilots. Their success proved what advocates of women pilots had argued all along. Flying skill was not determined by gender, but by training, intelligence, and temperament. Women who received proper training could fly anything that men could fly. Years later, Dora Doherty Struther would reflect on the B-29 demonstration with pride, but also with awareness of the larger significance. She and Moorman had not been chosen because they were the best pilots in the WASP program. They had been chosen because they were available and willing. The fact that they succeeded so completely suggested that many other WASP pilots could have done the same thing if given the opportunity. It's a lesson we see repeated throughout history. The demonstration proved that women's exclusion from combat flying was not based on capability, but on prejudice and tradition. The B-26 Marauder and B-29 Super Fortress represented the extreme end of aircraft difficulty and complexity. These were aircraft that had cost experienced pilots their lives. These were aircraft that other pilots feared and avoided, and WASP pilots flew them successfully, proving beyond any remaining doubt that women could handle any aircraft in the American arsenal. The answer to General Arnold's original question, can women fly military aircraft, had been answered definitively. Not only could they fly military aircraft, they could fly the most challenging military aircraft with skill that matched or exceeded that of many male pilots. Ferrying aircraft from factories to military bases was essential work, but it was relatively safe compared to some of the other missions WASP pilots performed. But if you thought flying the B-29 was the peak of the challenge, you'd be wrong. One of the most dangerous assignments given to WASP pilots was target towing, a mission that placed them directly in the line of fire during live anti-aircraft gunnery training. This mission required flying an aircraft while towing a large fabric sleeve behind it, giving anti-aircraft gunners on the ground a moving target to practice shooting at with live ammunition. The margin for error was razor-thin. Gunners were supposed to aim at the target sleeve, not the aircraft towing it. But gunners in training often missed, and their bullets frequently struck the towing aircraft instead. In July 1943, Jacqueline Cochran announced to 25 recent WASP graduates at Avenger Field that she had a top-secret assignment for them. She explained that they would be sent to Camp Davis in North Carolina to tow targets for anti-aircraft artillery practice. She told them the mission was voluntary, any pilot could opt out without consequences. What do you think happened? None did. All 25 volunteered immediately, eager to contribute to the war effort in any way possible. They knew the mission was dangerous, but danger was part of military flying. They packed their bags and reported to Camp Davis. Camp Davis was an anti-aircraft artillery training base on the North Carolina coast, where thousands of soldiers learned to operate the guns that would defend American forces and facilities from enemy aircraft. Effective anti-aircraft gunnery required practice with moving targets, and the most realistic practice involved shooting at actual aircraft towing target sleeves. The aircraft used for target towing at Camp Davis were mostly A-24 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers and A-25 Helldiver dive bombers, both of which had been withdrawn from frontline service due to obsolescence or damage. These were war-weary aircraft that had been flown hard and maintained poorly. Parts were scarce because production priorities focused on newer aircraft types. Maintenance crews often had to improvise repairs or skip them entirely. To make matters worse, and you can't make this stuff up, the aircraft were often fueled with 90-octane gasoline instead of the 100-octane fuel their engines required, causing performance problems and increasing the risk of engine failure. The target towing mission itself was straightforward, but, as you can imagine, nerve-wracking. A WASP pilot would take off from Camp Davis in an A-24 or similar aircraft with a long cable and target sleeve stowed in the aircraft. Once airborne, she would deploy the target sleeve, which trailed behind the aircraft on a cable approximately 1,000 feet long. She would then fly a predictable pattern along the beach at a specific altitude and speed while anti-aircraft gun crews on the ground tracked her aircraft and fired at the trailing target. The bullets were color-coded. Each gun crew used bullets dipped in a different color paint so that when the target was recovered after the mission, instructors could see which gun crew had achieved the most hits based on the colored marks on the fabric. The theory was simple. Gunners aimed at the target, not the aircraft. But as you've probably guessed, in practice, things were more complicated. Gunners in training often misjudged the distance and trajectory, sending bullets through the towing aircraft instead of the target behind it. Some gunners, and this is hard to believe, actually believed they were supposed to shoot the airplane, not understanding that the target was the fabric sleeve behind it. WASP pilots flying target towing missions regularly returned to base with bullet holes in their aircraft. The sound of bullets passing nearby became familiar and terrifying. Imagine trying to hold an aircraft perfectly steady while you hear bullets passing your cockpit. Pilots had to maintain steady flight on the designated course, even when they heard and saw anti-aircraft fire coming close to their aircraft. Flinching or deviating from the flight path would disrupt the training exercise and might actually increase the danger by moving the aircraft into a gunner's line of fire. The dangers of target towing went beyond what we now call friendly fire. The war-weary aircraft used for these missions were mechanically unreliable. Engine failures were common. Control systems failed. Fuel systems malfunctioned. Pilots had to be constantly alert for signs of mechanical trouble and ready to respond instantly to emergencies. And flying over water, survival was far from guaranteed. On August 23, 1943, WASP pilot Mabel Rawlinson was conducting night target towing training at Camp Davis when her A-24 developed mechanical problems shortly after takeoff. Her flight instructor, who was accompanying her on the training mission, told her to return to the airfield immediately. Rawlinson turned back and began her approach to land. As she came in low over the trees surrounding the field, her landing gear caught the top of a tall pine tree. The aircraft pitched forward violently and crashed nose first into the ground. The impact was devastating. The instructor was thrown clear of the wreckage and survived with injuries. But Rawlinson was trapped in the cockpit as the wreckage caught fire. Fellow WASP pilots and ground crew members rushed to the scene, but the intensity of the fire made a rescue impossible. Mabel Rawlinson lost her life in the crash, a tragic loss felt deeply by everyone at the base. The investigation into Rawlinson's death revealed what WASP pilots at Camp Davis had known for months. The aircraft assigned to them were maintained inadequately and were being operated with the wrong fuel. The 90-octane gasoline being used instead of the required 100-octane fuel reduced engine performance and reliability, contributing to mechanical failures. The Army Air Force's response to the investigation was to improve maintenance standards and ensure that aircraft used the correct fuel. But the improvements came too late for Mabel Rawlinson and the other WASP pilots who would lose their lives in target towing accidents. Just 1 month later, on September 23, 1943, another WASP pilot at Camp Davis lost her life during a target towing mission. Betty Taylor Wood was flying with the Camp Davis chaplain as a passenger when her aircraft experienced engine trouble. Wood attempted an emergency landing, but during the approach, her aircraft hit an embankment, stalled, and rolled inverted before crashing into the ground upside down. Both Wood and the chaplain were lost in the crash. Despite these tragic losses, WASP pilots continued to fly target towing missions throughout the war. They understood the risks, but they also understood the importance of the mission. American soldiers going into combat needed to know how to use anti-aircraft guns effectively, and realistic training was essential. WASP pilots provided that training, flying mission after mission despite the danger, despite the inadequate aircraft, despite losing their friends in crashes. Think about that level of dedication. Their courage and commitment to duty were extraordinary. Target towing was not the only dangerous mission WASP pilots performed. They also conducted check flights of aircraft that had just been repaired at maintenance facilities. Now, this was a special kind of challenge. When an aircraft suffered damage or mechanical failure and was repaired, someone had to test fly it to ensure the repairs had been successful and the aircraft was safe to return to service. This was inherently risky work because the aircraft being tested had already proven itself unreliable. There was no guarantee that repairs had fixed the problem completely. WASP pilots who volunteered for check flight duty knew they were flying aircraft that might fail again, possibly catastrophically. Faced with that knowledge, what would you have done? They climbed into those cockpits anyway, started the engines, and took off to test whether mechanics had done their jobs correctly. Many check flights ended without incident, but some ended in crashes when repairs proved inadequate or when previously undetected problems manifested during flight. WASP pilots also performed administrative missions, transporting personnel and cargo to bases across America. They flew aircraft of all types and sizes to wherever they were needed, often on short notice and in challenging weather. They delivered urgent spare parts, transported military officers to meetings and assignments, and performed countless other missions that kept the vast machinery of the Army Air Forces operating smoothly. You have to understand, these missions lacked the glamour of flying fighters or the drama of towing targets, but they were no less important to the war effort. By the end of 1944, WASP pilots had flown missions at 122 different air bases scattered across the continental United States. From the California coast to the Florida Peninsula, from Texas to Montana, WASP pilots flew wherever they were needed. They accumulated 60 million miles in the air. Just try to wrap your head around that number. An almost incomprehensible distance that represented thousands upon thousands of individual flights. They delivered over 12,650 aircraft of 78 different types. They completed tens of thousands of missions that freed male pilots for combat duty and kept American air power functioning at maximum effectiveness. 38 WASP pilots lost their lives during their service, 11 during training, and 27 on operational missions. They were lost in crashes, fires, and accidents that were the inevitable result of flying thousands of hours in difficult conditions with imperfect aircraft. Because WASP pilots were classified as civilian volunteers rather than military personnel, their families received no death benefits. The government did not pay to transport their bodies home for burial. Instead, fellow WASP pilots would often take up a collection to pay for sending their deceased friend's body home by train, with the WASP pilot serving as escort. The deceased WASP were not buried with military honors, and no American flag was draped over their coffins. Their families were not permitted to display a gold star in their window indicating that their loved one had been lost in service to their country. The women who gave their lives in service were treated as if their service had not mattered, as if their sacrifice was not worthy of recognition. It's a detail that, when you really stop and think about it, is heartbreaking. The surviving WASP pilots carried on, grieving their friends, but refusing to quit. They had a mission to complete, and they would see it through to the end, regardless of the cost. Their commitment to duty, their courage in the face of danger, and their refusal to accept limitations based on gender made them extraordinary. They had proven they could fly any aircraft in the American arsenal. Now they had proven they could perform any mission, no matter how dangerous, with skill and determination equal to any pilot in the military. By late 1944, WASP pilots had already proven they could fly every type of production military aircraft in the American arsenal, from primary trainers to the massive B-29 Superfortress. But the story doesn't even end there. A handful of WASP pilots would go even further, flying experimental aircraft that represented the future of military aviation. These cutting-edge aircraft used technologies that, at the time, most pilots had never even heard of: turbojet engines instead of propellers, rocket-assisted takeoff systems, and advanced radar-directed weapon systems. Flying these experimental aircraft required not just skill, but a willingness to venture into the unknown, to test technologies that might revolutionize aviation or might fail catastrophically. One WASP pilot in particular would make history by becoming the first American woman to fly a jet aircraft. Anne Baumgartner was born on August 27, 1918, in Augusta, Georgia. Like many women of her generation, she was inspired to fly by Amelia Earhart, who visited her elementary school when Baumgartner was a young girl. Baumgartner attended Smith College, where she graduated in 1940 with a degree in pre-med. While working in the public relations department at Eastern Airlines after graduation, she learned to fly at Somerset Hills Airport in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. She and another aspiring pilot pooled their money to buy a tired old Cub airplane and flew constantly to build up the hours needed for a commercial license. By the time the WASP program began recruiting, Baumgartner had accumulated the necessary flight hours and was eager to contribute to the war effort. Baumgartner was accepted into the WASP training class that began in January 1943 at Houston, Texas, before the program moved to Avenger Field in Sweetwater. She graduated in July 1943 and received an unusual assignment. She was posted to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, where the Army Air Forces conducted research and testing of experimental aircraft and equipment. This was the Area 51 of its day. Wright Field was the heart of American aviation innovation, where engineers and test pilots pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Baumgartner became the only WASP permanently assigned to Wright Field, working as an assistant operations officer in the fighter test section. At Wright Field, Baumgartner flew a wide variety of aircraft in test and evaluation roles. She conducted in-flight refueling test missions, an experimental technology that would later become standard, but was still being developed during World War II. She tested new gun sights and weapon systems. She flew the RP-47E, an experimental version of the P-47 Thunderbolt that featured the first pressurized cockpit in an American fighter, allowing pilots to fly at extremely high altitudes without oxygen masks. Each test flight provided data that engineers used to improve aircraft design and capabilities. In October 1944, Baumgartner received a special assignment. She was asked to test fly the WWII P-59A Aerocomet. This is the moment aviation history changed. America's first turbojet-powered fighter aircraft. The WWII-59A represented a revolutionary leap in aviation technology. Instead of using a traditional piston engine turning a propeller, the WWII-59A used two General Electric turbojets that produced thrust by burning fuel in a continuous stream and expelling hot exhaust gases at high velocity. Jet engines had several theoretical advantages over piston engines. They were simpler mechanically, they produced more power for their weight, and they could operate effectively at very high altitudes where piston engines struggled due to thin air. But jet technology was brand new in 1944, and everything about flying a jet aircraft was unfamiliar. You have to remember, there was no manual for this. On October 14th, 1944, and Baumgartner climbed into the cockpit of the WWII P-59A at Wright Field. The aircraft looked different from any other fighter she had flown. Its nose was rounded and smooth, with no propeller. Its twin jet engines were mounted inside the fuselage on either side of the cockpit, with air intakes in the wing roots and exhaust nozzles protruding from the rear fuselage. The cockpit instruments were similar to those in conventional aircraft, but the engine gauges showed different information: turbine temperature, fuel flow, RPM. There was no propeller pitch control, no mixture control, no carburetor heat. All the controls that piston engine pilots took for granted were absent. Imagine your entire muscle memory being wrong. Baumgartner started the engines, feeling and hearing the unfamiliar whine of turbines spooling up instead of the familiar roar of a piston engine. She taxied to the runway, her training and experience guiding her even though everything felt different. She advanced the throttles and felt the aircraft accelerate smoothly down the runway. The acceleration was different from a propeller aircraft, smoother, more linear, without the vibration and torque that characterized piston engine fighters. The WWII-59A lifted off and climbed away from Wright Field. and Baumgartner had just become the first American woman to fly a jet aircraft, a distinction she would hold for the next 10 years. The WASP-59A was not a particularly impressive aircraft by later jet fighter standards. Its top speed of only 413 miles per hour was actually slower than the fastest piston-engine fighters like the P-51 Mustang. Its climb rate and maneuverability were unexceptional. The Army Air Forces ultimately decided not to order the WASP-59A for combat service, instead using it as a trainer to familiarize pilots with jet technology while waiting for more advanced jets to be developed. But the WASP-59A's importance was not in its performance, but in what it represented: the point of no return, the future of military aviation. Within a few years, jets would completely replace piston-engine fighters, and the WASP-59A was the first step on that path. General Hap Arnold recognized the significance of Baumgartner's achievement. At the graduation ceremony for the final WASP class on December 7, 1944, Arnold specifically mentioned Baumgartner's jet flight as an example of how WASP pilots had proven themselves capable of handling the most advanced aircraft and technologies America could produce. Her flight demonstrated that as aviation technology advanced, women would remain capable of mastering it. Gender was not a barrier to flying jets any more than it had been a barrier to flying propeller aircraft. Other WASP pilots worked with different experimental technologies. Some flew aircraft equipped with early radar systems used for targeting and navigation. These systems were primitive by modern standards, but represented cutting-edge technology in World War II. WASP pilots helped test and evaluate these systems, providing feedback that helped engineers improve their designs. Some WASP pilots flew aircraft equipped with rocket-assisted takeoff systems, which used small solid-fuel rockets attached to the aircraft to provide extra thrust during takeoff, allowing heavily loaded aircraft to take off from shorter runways. The rockets were temperamental and sometimes failed or exploded, making test flights demanding and exciting. The work WASP pilots did with experimental aircraft and technologies receives less attention than their more visible achievements in ferrying fighters and bombers. But what the official reports don't always tell you is it was no less significant. By participating in flight testing and evaluation of cutting-edge technologies, WASP pilots helped advance American aviation capabilities. They provided data, identified problems, suggested improvements, and demonstrated that women could master not just the aircraft of 1944, but the aircraft of the future. When critics suggested that women might be capable of flying current aircraft, but would be unable to handle the more complex aircraft that would come in the future, WASP pilots like Baumgartner had already proven those critics wrong by flying jets and testing technologies that would define the next generation of military aviation. December 7, 1944. Exactly 3 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor that had brought America into World War II, the final class of WASP pilots gathered at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, for their graduation ceremony. 114 women stood in formation wearing their distinctive silver wings, ready to receive their certificates and join the ranks of women pilots who had already proven themselves in service to their country. But this graduation ceremony would be different from all the previous ceremonies at Avenger Field. This would be the last graduation ceremony because the WASP program was ending. And the speaker at this final ceremony would be General Hap Arnold himself. Can you imagine the anticipation in that crowd? The man who had questioned whether a slip of a girl could handle military aircraft and who had approved the WASP program as an experiment to answer that question. Arnold stood before the assembled women and spoke words that represented a complete reversal of the skepticism he had expressed just 2 years earlier. Frankly, Arnold said, I didn't know in 1941 whether a slip of a girl could fight the controls of AB-17 in the heavy weather they would naturally encounter in operational flying. Well, now in 1944, more than 2 years later, it is on the record that women can fly as well as men. Those words, "it is on the record," carried enormous weight. You have to understand, Arnold was not expressing a personal opinion or making a political statement. He was stating a documented fact based on evidence accumulated over 2 years of operations. WASP pilots had compiled a record of achievement that could not be disputed or dismissed. The record Arnold referred to as comprehensive and impressive. Between September 1942, when the first WFS pilots began ferrying aircraft, and December 1944, when the WASP program ended, women pilots had accumulated over 60 million miles of flight time. They had delivered 12,652 aircraft of 78 different types. They had flown at 122 air bases across the continental United States. They had performed every type of mission assigned to them: ferrying, target towing, test flying, check flights, transport, flight instruction, and administrative flights. The sheer scale of this is hard to overstate. 1,074 women had graduated from the training program at Avenger field out of 1,830 who had been accepted for training. The safety record of WASP pilots was comparable to that of male pilots performing similar duties. Their accident rate per flying hour was not higher than the rate for male pilots, despite the fact that WASP pilots often flew war-weary aircraft and performed dangerous missions like target towing. During the last 6 months of 1944, every P-47 Thunderbolt that left the Republic Aviation Factory on Long Island was ferried by a WASP pilot. Let that statistic sink in for just a moment. Every single one. Male ferry pilots had been reassigned to other duties, and WASP pilots had taken over completely. This statistic alone demonstrated how completely WASP pilots had proven their competence. The Army Air Forces would not have entrusted the delivery of one of its most important fighters entirely to women pilots if there had been any doubt about their capabilities. WASP pilots had flown 77 different types of aircraft during the program. The list read like a catalog of every significant American military aircraft of World War II. Primary trainers: PT-13 Cadet, PT-17 Steerman, PT-19. Basic trainers: BT-13 Valiant, BT-15. Advanced trainers: at 6 Texan, at 9, at 10, at 11. Fighters: P-38 Lightning, P-39 Air Cobra, P-40 Warhawk, P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang, P-63 King Cobra. Bombers: A-20 Havoc, A-24 Dauntless, A-25 Helldiver, A-26 Invader, B-17 Flying Fortress, B-24 Liberator, B-25 Mitchell, B-26 Marauder, B-29 Superfortress. Transport aircraft: C-45, C-46 Commando, C-47 Skitran, C-54 Skytaster, C-60, C-78. Even the experimental Bell-White P-59A jet fighter. Think about that arsenal for a second. If it had wings and the Army Air Forces flew it, WASP pilots flew it too. So, you see, the answer to the question Arnold had posed in December 1942, "Can a slip of a girl handle military aircraft?" had been answered so completely that there could be no further debate. Yes, women could handle military aircraft. Not just small, simple trainers, but heavy bombers, high-performance fighters, experimental jets, every type of aircraft in the American arsenal. They could fly in bad weather, handle emergencies, perform dangerous missions, and do everything that male pilots did. Gender was not a determining factor in flying ability. Training, skill, judgment, and courage were what mattered, and women possessed those qualities in equal measure to men. Arnold's speech at the final graduation ceremony acknowledged this reality. His words represented not just his personal conclusion, but the official position of the Army Air Forces based on 2 years of documented evidence. The experiment had succeeded beyond what even its most optimistic supporters had predicted. The question that had been genuinely open in 1942 had been definitively answered by December 1944. It was now on the record, documented in official reports and statistics, proven by the accumulated experience of over 1,000 women pilots flying millions of miles across America. Women could fly as well as men. Not almost as well, not nearly as well as men, equally. That was the conclusion the evidence supported, and Arnold stated it plainly. But even as Arnold praised the WASP pilots and acknowledged their achievements, the program was ending. The final class would receive their wings, and then, within 2 weeks, every WASP pilot would be released from service. The program that had proven so successful was being disbanded, and the women who had served with such distinction were being sent home. And this is the part of the story that's hardest to understand. Why? If the WASP had proven themselves so completely, why was the program ending instead of expanding? The answer lay not in the capabilities of the women pilots, but in the politics and economics of late 1944. By December 1944, the war situation had changed dramatically from the desperate days of 1942 when the program had begun. Germany was in retreat on all fronts, and Allied victory in Europe was no longer in doubt. It was only a matter of time. The massive expansion of the Army Air Forces that had created a pilot shortage in 1942 had been completed. The training pipeline was producing more male pilots than were needed for combat assignments. Male pilots who had expected to fly combat missions found themselves assigned to ferrying and domestic duties instead. These male pilots, frustrated at being denied combat assignments, lobbied Congress to eliminate the WASP program so that the ferrying missions would be available to them. Male civilian pilots who had been deferred from military service also lobbied against the WASP program, fearing that women pilots represented competition for post-war aviation jobs. This, you see, was the political reality. In June 1944, Congress had been considering a bill that would militarize the WASP program, giving WASP pilots official military status, ranks, and benefits. The bill would have ended the anomaly of civilian women pilots flying military aircraft without military protection or recognition. Jackie Cochran and other WASP supporters testified before Congress in favor of militarization. But opponents of the WASP program, including male civilian pilots organizations, lobbied intensely against the bill, arguing that there was no longer a need for women pilots since male pilots were now available in sufficient numbers. Congress rejected the militarization bill, effectively condemning the WASP program to end, since it could not continue indefinitely as a civilian organization operating within a military structure. General Arnold had no choice but to terminate the program. On December 20th, 1944, less than 2 weeks after the final graduation ceremony, the WASP program officially ended. All WASP pilots were released from service. They received no veterans benefits, no continued military affiliation, no recognition for their service. They were told to pay their own way home from their duty stations. Many WASP pilots emptied their lockers, packed their belongings, and bought train tickets home using their own savings. After flying millions of miles in service to their country, after proving beyond any doubt that they were fully qualified military pilots, they were simply dismissed. Imagine being in their position, told to go back to civilian life, as if the previous 2 years had never happened. But Arnold's words at the graduation ceremony remained on the record. Women can fly as well as men. That conclusion, reached through 2 years of rigorous testing under wartime conditions, could not be erased by political decisions or congressional votes. And that is the ultimate takeaway from this part of the story. The WASP pilots had proven what they set out to prove. They had answered the question that had been posed at the beginning. They had demonstrated that gender was not a barrier to flying military aircraft. That achievement could not be taken away from them, even if recognition and appreciation were denied. When the WASP program ended in December 1944, over 1,000 women pilots returned to civilian life with, and this is the unbelievable part, nothing official to show for their service. They had no veterans benefits, no military discharge papers, no official recognition that they had served their country during wartime. The silver wings they had earned were not military insignia recognized by the armed forces. The service they had given was not acknowledged in any official capacity. For the next 3 decades, the WASP pilots were largely forgotten by the American public and ignored by the military establishment. But the women who had served as WASP pilots never forgot what they had accomplished, and they never stopped fighting for the recognition they had earned. But perhaps the most painful aspect of the lack of recognition was how the 38 WASP who had lost their lives during their service were treated. These women had given their lives flying military aircraft on military missions for the United States Army Air Forces during wartime. By any reasonable definition, they had been lost in service to their country. But because they were classified as civilian employees rather than military personnel, their losses were not treated as military losses. Their families received no death benefits, no military funeral services, no flag to drape over the coffin, no gold star to display in the window. When a WASP was lost in a crash, her body was shipped home at the expense of her family or through collections taken up by fellow WASP pilots. The government paid nothing. The military held no memorial services. It's a detail that, when you really stop and think about it, is infuriating. It was as if their sacrifice did not matter, as if their service was worthless. For the families of the 38, this treatment was devastating. Cornelia Ford, one of the original WFS pilots who had witnessed the Pearl Harbor attack and who was lost in a mid-air collision in March 1943, was buried in her hometown of Nashville, Tennessee, without military honors. Mabel Rawlinson, who was lost in the fiery crash at Camp Davis after her canopy jammed shut, was buried in Illinois without military recognition. All 38 of the WASP who had lost their lives received the same treatment, civilian burials with no acknowledgement of their military service. Their families were left to wonder why their loved one's sacrifice was not valued by the country they had served. And if you think the story ends there for the survivors, they faced their own challenges. Many had hoped to continue flying after the war, but opportunities for women pilots in civilian aviation were extremely limited. Airlines refused to hire women as pilots. Flight instruction jobs were scarce and usually went to male veterans. Some WASP pilots managed to continue flying by working as crop dusters, flight instructors at small airports, or charter pilots. Others gave up flying entirely because they could not afford to maintain their licenses and skills without steady work. The war had opened opportunities for women in aviation, but the post-war period saw those opportunities close again as returning male veterans were claimed jobs in aviation and women were expected to return to traditional domestic roles. Imagine the frustration. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, former WASP pilots occasionally tried to draw attention to their service and to lobby for recognition, but their efforts made little progress. The American public had moved on from World War II, and stories about women pilots who had served domestically seemed unimportant compared to the dramatic combat stories of male veterans. The women had no organization to represent them, no unified voice to advocate for their interests. Individual WASP pilots told their stories to family members and friends, but few people outside their immediate circles knew what they had accomplished. In 1972, a group of former WASP pilots formed an organization called the Order of Fifinella to preserve their history and to lobby for official recognition of their service. Fifinella was the name of the WASP mascot, a female gremlin character created by Walt Disney specifically for the WASP program. The Order of Fifinella brought together WASP pilots who had lost touch after the war and created a network that could advocate for veteran status and benefits. The organization researched the history of the WASP program, collected documents and photographs, interviewed members, and began building a historical record that had been largely neglected by official military historians. Then, in 1977, 33 years later, the fight finally paid off. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, himself a pilot and a supporter of military aviation, championed the legislation. President Jimmy Carter signed it into law, officially recognizing that WASP pilots had served in the military during World War II and were entitled to veterans' benefits. The WASP pilots who were still alive could finally apply for veterans' benefits, and the families of deceased WASP could request military burial honors for their loved ones. It was a partial victory, decades overdue, but it was significant. The government had finally acknowledged officially what had been true all along. WASP pilots were military veterans who had served their country honorably during wartime. And the recognition didn't stop there. In 2009, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The award recognized their pioneering military service and exemplary record, which forged revolutionary reform in the armed forces of the United States. 300 WASP pilots or their family members attended the ceremony at the United States Capitol, where leaders from both political parties praised the WASP for their courage, skill, and perseverance. The women who had been dismissed without recognition in 1944 were finally being honored at the highest level. But by 2009, fewer than 300 of the original 1,074 WASP graduates were still alive. Most had waited over 60 years for this recognition. The legacy of the WASP extends far beyond the statistics of how many miles they flew or how many aircraft they delivered. The WASP proved conclusively that women could fly military aircraft as well as men, a fact that would have profound implications for the future. And this is where you can still see their impact today. When the United States Air Force opened combat pilot positions to women in 1993, that decision was built on the foundation the WASP had laid 50 years earlier. The first women to fly fighters and bombers in combat for the United States military followed a path that had been cleared by the WASP pilots who flew those same aircraft types during World War II. Every woman who has flown as a military pilot since 1993 owes a debt to the WASP pioneers who proved it could be done. The WASP also demonstrated something larger about American society and about the capabilities of women more generally. In the 1940s, most Americans believed that certain jobs were simply beyond women's capabilities due to physical or mental limitations. Flying military aircraft, especially heavy bombers and high-performance fighters, was considered one of those jobs that women could not do. The WASP proved that belief was false. They showed that with proper training and opportunity, women could master highly technical, physically demanding, and dangerous work that had been considered exclusively male. Their success challenged assumptions about gender roles and capabilities that had been taken for granted for generations. So, we come back to the central question we asked at the beginning. Could American female pilots really fly every military aircraft in World War II? The answer, as you've now seen, is definitively yes. They could and they did. Not some aircraft. Not most aircraft. Every aircraft. All 77 types that were in the Army Air Force's inventory. From the smallest primary trainers to the massive B-29 Super Fortress. From stable transport planes to temperamental fighters with reputations as widowmakers. From piston-engine propeller aircraft to experimental jets. WASP pilots flew them all, and they flew them well, compiling safety records comparable to male pilots and completing every mission assigned to them. The WASP did not just fly those aircraft. They mastered them. They demonstrated emergency procedures in B-29 Super Fortresses when experienced male pilots were afraid to fly them. They ferried every P-47 Thunderbolt from the factory for 6 months straight. They flew target towing missions that put them directly in the line of fire. They test flew experimental aircraft with unproven technologies. They flew check flights in aircraft that had already failed once and been repaired. They did all of this as civilian volunteers without military rank, without military benefits, without even the promise of recognition for their service. They did it because they loved flying and because they wanted to serve their country in its time of need. 38 of them gave their lives in that service, being lost in crashes and accidents that were the inevitable result of flying dangerous missions in difficult conditions with imperfect aircraft. Those 38 paid the ultimate price for their desire to serve. Their sacrifice was no less meaningful than the sacrifice of male pilots who were lost in combat, yet it went unrecognized for decades. In 2013, 70 years after many of them were lost, the United States Army finally conducted memorial services for all 38 deceased WASP pilots, giving them the military honors they had been denied when they died. Army Chaplain Captain J. Clemens organized the project, ensuring that each of the 38 received a proper memorial acknowledging her service and sacrifice. It was another belated recognition, but it mattered to the families and to the surviving WASP pilots who had never forgotten their fallen friends. When you look at all the facts, the story of the WASP is ultimately a story about the power of evidence over prejudice. In 1942, General Arnold and most of the military establishment doubted that women could fly military aircraft effectively. That doubt was based not on evidence, but on assumptions about gender and capability. The WASP program provided the evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Women could fly military aircraft as well as men. That conclusion was not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It was documented fact based on 2 years of operations and 60 million miles of flight time. When confronted with incontrovertible evidence, even those who had been most skeptical were forced to acknowledge the truth. Arnold himself made that acknowledgement in December 1944 when he said, "It is on the record that women can fly as well as men." That record has never been challenged or refuted because it cannot be. The achievements of the WASP pilots are historical facts. They flew 77 different types of aircraft. They accumulated 60 million miles. They delivered over 12,000 aircraft. They flew at 122 bases. They completed every mission assigned to them. 38 of them were lost in service. 1,074 of them earned their silver wings. These are not claims or assertions. These are documented facts recorded in official Army Air Forces records and preserved in the National Archives. The record is clear, comprehensive, and undeniable. So, when we ask that original question one last time, could American female pilots really fly every military aircraft in World War II? We are not asking a hypothetical question. We are asking about something that actually happened. Something that was documented and verified. The answer is yes, they could and they did. They flew every military aircraft in the American arsenal during World War II, proving that skill in the cockpit has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with training, determination, and courage. The Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP, proved that women could do what many people believed was impossible. They did not just meet the standards set for them. They exceeded those standards and demonstrated capabilities that even their supporters had not anticipated. They earned their place in history through merit and achievement, not through special treatment or lowered standards. They were pilots, pure and simple, who happened to be women. And they were exceptional. Their legacy lives on today in every woman who flies as a military pilot, in every woman who pursues a career that was once considered exclusively male, in every person who refuses to accept limitations based on gender or any other arbitrary characteristic. The WASP proved that with opportunity and training, people can accomplish far more than prejudice and assumption would allow. And that is a lesson learned in the skies over America during World War II that remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago. The WASP pilots showed us what is possible when capability is valued over convention, when evidence triumphs over prejudice, when people are given the chance to prove themselves on their merits. That is their lasting gift to American history and to all who value fairness, equality, and the unlimited potential of human achievement.